In this lesson, we're again going to do a couple of projects. In other words, we'll create additional Python programs to reinforce some of the learning concepts that we've been covering so far. So in project B, for instance, we will create two different Python programs, and both relate to either creating averages or working with some sort of mathematics. Okay? Don't worry, I'll keep things simple so that it's easier for you to follow. The important aspect here is to understand how to write programs. So in this first program, we will calculate miles per gallon. So let's say you drive your car every day and you like to figure out and calculate how many miles per gallon does your car run. And we will prompt the user for input for both enter the miles and gallon. And then have Python calculate or do the calculation for us. So let me jump right in. Let's click on File. Let me open up our Python editor. Click on New File. Let me resize. Perfect. So start off with a comment. So I'm going to say calculating miles per gallon. Now before I even start creating the program, keep this in mind that every programmer or developer or coder, whether you're using Python or any other language, you'd have your own way of doing things, right? Maybe your own logic, maybe you'll have a couple of additional steps that you like to incorporate, and so on. The idea here is to make sure or keep this in mind that whenever you're working with any programming language, draw up something, right? So think about the code in a logical manner. So here, for instance, I'm going to keep things simple. I'm in fact going to start off with a print statement, and I'm going to say print this program calculates miles per gallon, and of course close my parentheses and give it a space here. So next, let me write another comment here. Get miles driven from the user. So I'm going to ask input from the user. So here I'm going to ask input from the user. And what is that input? I'm going to say something like miles driven, or define a variable here, equals input. I'm going to say enter miles driven, right? Just asking the user a simple question. Once I've defined the variable, a simple assignment statement. Next, the miles driven could be a float number, right? It doesn't have to be an integer. So either I could say float input, or I can say convert the integer into a float. So both ways are correct. In other words, I can use the same statement and type float to a parentheses input, or I can always use something like convert text entered to a float point number, right? And to do this, I can say something like miles driven, right? Same variable, equals, simply use float, and then say miles driven. So instead of a one-step process, I simply divided or created a new step, where first I defined miles driven equals input, asking the user for an input, and whatever the user enters is going to convert the text here to a float point number. So even if the user entered an integer, Python is going to convert it into a float text number. Next, I'm going to ask the user for a new input. So I'm going to say get gallons used from the user, right? So the user is also going to tell us how much gas was used or how many gallons were used. So here I'm going to define a variable, gallons used equals, once again, input, and enter gallons used. And next I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to convert again. Right, so I'm going to say convert text entered to a float point number. And once I'm done with my comment here, I can simply say gallons used equals float, and once again gallons used, right? Make sure we keep our same variables here. Great. And finally, I'm going to say calculate. This is where a formula would come in, right? Calculate and print the answer. And to do this, I'm going to say the variable miles per gallon equals miles driven, and this is our first variable up here, right? Enter the miles driven right here, and I'm going to say divide by gallons used. This is how you would get your answer. And finally, print the output. So I'm going to say print something like miles per gallon, and then the variable itself. Perfect. So a simple program of calculating miles per gallon. Right off the bat, I printed out this program calculates MPG, where I can specify, of course, miles per gallon instead of MPG, so users understands, right? So whoever looks at the program knows that this program is going to do something. Next, ask the input for the user. Simple variable, asking for the input, converting the input into a float point number, then asking the user for the gallons used, converting that into a float point number, and then finally simply calculating the actual miles per gallon by dividing miles driven by gallons used and printing out our answer. Let's click on run, see what happens. Run module. Of course, save your module first, click OK. This brings up our Windows Explorer. Navigate to the Python folder, and I'm going to say miles per gallon as the name of the module. Click save, and Python tells me, or gives me a title in fact, that this program calculates miles per gallon. Wonderful. Enter miles driven. Let's say I drove 95 miles. Hit enter. Next, I need to enter the gallons used. So maybe I used 12 gallons. Hit enter, and Python tells me that 7.91 is what I used as miles per gallon. So just as simple. I can remove the float, and then I would have the answer as integers. I can add more to this code, for instance, so that I can build upon this existing program. Maybe I want to find out the distances or the costs, or add more code regarding price and multiply price by the gallon to come up with how much did I spend throughout my journey. And of course, sky's the limit, so it's up to you. Great. So simple program. Let's do another one. I'm going to do another program here. So I'm going to click on File, New File, and close the previous one. And let me resize this so that we can also see. Next, let's see what kind of program should we create. How about some averages, right? So we're going to take some test scores and we're going to create some averages of test scores by students. Let me in fact minimize this and see slide here. So here in this project, we will create an average for test scores of students. And we will use test scores of 5 students, 3 or 5. It doesn't really matter. I just wrote 5 students so that we get an idea. Let's bring up our editor one more time. Back up. Here we go. Great. So let's start off with a comment. Creating averages. So I can say something like student 1 equals integer and ask for the input from the user. So I can say input and then enter test score for student 1. Similarly, I'm going to say student 2. Of course, the easiest way is to copy it because I'm going to use multiple students and that is going to require the same input, right? So all that is going to be changed is perhaps the student 1, 2, and so on. So I'm just going to copy this and use the keyboard shortcut as Control-C to copy, and then Control-V to paste. and make sure I change my student 1 to 2, because this line asks for the input for student 2's score. Similarly, I can simply in fact copy this entire line now, Control C, and simply change student 2 to 3 here, and of course my name of the variable as well. So here's my third student. Similarly, I'm going to have my fourth and fifth students. So I'm going to have 5 students. So there's 1, 2, 3, and this is my fourth, and this is my student number 5. And likewise, I need to make sure that I keep consistent, right? So I don't make any mistakes. Perfect. So 5 input statements. Next, of course, I'm going to calculate the average. Pretty straightforward. Write a comment here. Calculate the average score. And here's the formula. So I'm going to use the average variable here and simply say student 1. Next is my student 2. And of course, student 3. And a couple of more, student 4. And then last one is student 5. So far I have 5 students. Close my parentheses, and I'm of course going to divide this by 5. That's how you come up with the averages, right? So it's 1 through 5 students, you divide them by 5, you'd get your average. And next, of course, I need to print the test score by giving a print command. So here's my print. The average score is, and Python is going to give us the result. Of course, I need my variable here because that's how Python would give the result. Perfect. So 5 students. I'm going to enter the integers for all these 5 students, or the scores of these 5 students, and there could be any scores. And Python is going to calculate the average. Let's see what happens when I run this. So let's click on run module. Of course, the source must be saved. Click OK. And I'm going to call it AVG as average. It's the name of the module. Click Save. And Python asks me enter test score for student 1. Let's say student 1 scored 90. Great score. Enter test score for student 2. Maybe 88. Enter test score for student 3. How about 92 once again? And then my 4th student scored maybe 77. And my 5th and my last student, in fact, topped the class by scoring 95 out of 100. So once I've entered 5 students, and this satisfies the requirements of my input, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I hit enter, Python is going to calculate the average automatically, saying the average score is 88.4. And this is how Python prints it. So once again, Python, extremely powerful programming language, easy to use, very logical, straightforward. You just have to practice with some of the functions and methods and understand how to code in Python. And of course, the more you practice, the easier it'll become. So I hope this helps. Let's move to our next lesson.